today. So the topic for today is about the introduction to management science. That is chapter 1. So our topic outline for today is first, problem solving and decision making. Second, quantitative analysis and decision making. And we have quantitative analysis model development, under which are the data preparation, model solution, report generation, and a note regarding implementation. So start. The objectives is to provide students with a sound conceptual understanding of the role that management science plays in the decision-making process, and to reinforce the application's nature of the text and provide a better understanding of the variety of applications in which management science has been used successfully. Management science, other terms includes operations research, decision science, layera na sila, is an approach to decision-making based on the scientific method, makes extensive use of quantitative analysis. Now, scientific management that was initiated by Frederick W. Taylor originated in the early 1990s. He provided a foundation for the use of the quantitative methods in management. However, modern management revolution that originated during the World War II period, when teams were formed to deal with strategic and tactical problems faced by the military. So these teams consisted actually of mga diverse specialties like mga engineers din sila, mga mathematicians, mga na. But later on, after the World War II, some of these members of the teams actually pursue to study management science. The developments that occurred during the post-World War II period lead to the growth and use of management science in non-military applications. So sa una, gigamit ang management science for tactics nila as a military application. But after so, gigamit na siya into non-military applications. So number one, the continued research resulted in numerous methodological developments. So example ani is the discovery by George Danzig in 1947 of the simplex method for solving linear programming problems. So kani siya mo ni development, and then ni-evolve and later on gigamit na siya into solving problems in and developing computers. This also lead to the second development that occurred during the post-World War II, which is the virtual explosion in computing power like digital computers. So, example of which are the personal computers can now be used to solve problems larger than those solved in mainframe computers in the 1990s. So, tungod sa method for solving linear programming problems by George Danzig, na-discover siya and then made into programs digital computers, which also evolved nga gigamit na nato karon in to make our lives easier, faster, and more convenient, especially in the making of decisions. Sorry, ito sa problem solving and decision making. Problem solving is the process of identifying a difference between the actual and the desired state of affairs and then taking an action to resolve the difference. Of course, that's problem solving. Now, in cases like solving problems in a company, for example, it is important to justify the time and effort of careful analysis. So otherwise, it would create a much greater trouble, which might be out of hand on. So, imagine having problem from your problem. So, in solving problems, we must follow these 7 steps. So first, to identify and define the problem. You have to know your problem by knowing the root cause of it. And then, after so, proceed ka sa Number 2, determine the set of alternatives. So what solution or solutions must you think to address the issue? So usually, ikaw is a decision maker or the manager. You must think of more than one solution. So there will be varied choices. And then, proceed ka sa number 3. Determine the criteria. So, know your criteria and determining the appropriate action or alternatives. So, from that, your choices would be filtered. Dapat imong criteria naka-align sa kung unsa imong objectives. And then, number 4, evaluate the alternatives. You have to apply the criterion to your alternative to be able to evaluate them thoroughly. So, imo na siyang tarungon og assess. And then number 5, choose an alternative. This is when you decide what is the most appropriate and more productive nga alternative. Before proceeding to number 6, implement the selected alternative. That is applying the alternative na nimo and then see for the results after niya. And then lastly, number 7, this is when evaluating the result to determine whether a satisfactory solution has been obtained. So, you have to follow up the alternatives that you have implemented to see if it actually solved the problem and has bear positive result. Not just to the management, but to the customers and consumers who are your target market. So, kani siyang 1 to 5, they are called decision making because diri ka mag-structure sa imong mag-organize sa imong problem. And then sa 6 ug 7, if you have kanang nakabantay mo, this is the implementation of the alternative and evaluating of the chosen alternative. So this is when your problem is solved. This is the problem solving. Okay, so may narito sa example. Number 1, define the problem. So, imong problem, for the moment, you are currently unemployed and your job search resulted in offers of the following companies in Rochester, New York, Dallas, Texas, Greensboro, North Carolina, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So, mana siya upat kabuok. So, after kabaw na ka mong problem, you have to identify the alternative. So, either accept the position in Rochester, accept the position in Dallas, in Greensboro, or in Pittsburgh. So, mana na imong alternatives, mana imong pilian to solve your problem. And then, proceed ka sa number 3. Determine the criteria. Unsa may criteria nimo sa pagpili sa job. For example, ang imong criteria is the highest starting salary. Pinakataas na salary. So, if ang imuhang criteria kay usara kana ra highest starting salary, makonsider na to siya as single criterion decision problem. But kung daghan, for example, pun animo ang imong criteria into the potential for advancement nimo and the location of the job. So, tulo na sila. If more than one ang imong criteria, that is the multi-criteria decision problems ang tawag niya. So, after nimo determine sa criteria, proceed ka sa number 4 na step. Evaluate the alternatives. So, sa mga alternatives, mga alternatives. For example, alternative from Rochester, Dallas, Greensboro, and Pittsburgh. So, yung starting salary mo ni siya, 48,500, 46,000, 46,000, 47,000. And then, potential advancement nimo, excellent ka diri sa Dallas. And then, ang job location, ang imong excellent diri sa Greensboro. Probably mo na ang pinaka-duol nimo, ang pinaka-convenient para nimo. So, imong tan-aw ng imong mga alternatives based sa imong kanintulong nga criteria nga imong gi-provide. So, proceed ka, number 5, choose an alternative. So, mo ni, pag humani mo og assess nila, for example, pila man akong starting salary diri 48, dako ni siya. Pero ang iyang potential for advancement and job location average raman. So diri ang job location ako excellent, pero ang akong starting salary di kaya dako. Mo siya pinaka-less kani okay ra 47. Pero ang akong job location good raman, di man medyo layo man siya. So for example, ang imuhang napili kay number 3. Ato ka sa Greensboro. Imong starting salary 46, imong potential for advancement good. Pero imong gipili nga mas duol ka. Job location niya it's excellent. So, kanang number 3, siguro, mo na siya imuhang consider nga decision. Proceed ka. Number 6 and number 7, mo na siya ang problem solving, di ba? Implementing the selected alternative and evaluating the results. So, kani sila, the last two steps are made to emphasize the limited scope of the term decision-making as compared to the term problem-solving. Because diri na kamo trabaho implementing the selective alternative. And after so, imo na i-assess kung sakto ba ni ako ang desisyon. So, diri na ang imuhang problem-solving. While the first 5 steps are considered the decision-making. So, mali siya. Para makita dyan nato ang relationship sa problem solving o decision making, diri ka sa kung diri ka sa problem solving, gikan gid siya sa defining the problem up to evaluating the result, mo na ang problem solving. So hangtod nga ma-evaluate na gid nimo ang result niya. But decision making, diri ka sa defining the problem, identifying the alternatives, determining the criteria, and evaluating the alternatives and choosing an alternative, diri ra ka mo stop. From the moment ka naka-choose na kog alternative and which is your decision, dira na mag-stop ang imong decision making. Because kung padayon ka sa implement the decision and evaluating the result, that is considered problem solving already. Because kita naman ka sa imong end result. Okay. Ano siya? An alternate classification decision-making process. Katong 5 sa decision-making process. So, mag-define kasi mong problem, identify nimong alternatives, imong i-determine ang criteria, mo na imong structuring. Pag-organize sa imuhang possible solution. But when you evaluate the alternatives na and choose an alternative, this is when you already analyze the problem. So, the two forms of decision-making process. So, decision-making, pwede na siya nga yung decision is through qualitative or quantitative. So, kani siya. So, qualitative is based on the manager's judgment and experience. Intuitive or feel for the problem and is more an art than a science. While quantitative is based on facts that will be developed into mathematical expressions. Kaya ba nataan na? So, if the manager has more experience in dealing with similar problems, then he or she can decide qualitatively. However, if the manager has little to no experience in solving such problem and is sufficiently complex, then the manager can use the quantitative approach. So, when using gani sa quantitative approach, an analyst will concentrate on the quantitative facts or data, mga factual data. So, nga associated sa problem and develop these facts niya into mathematical expression, which describes the objectives, constraints, and other relationships that exist in the problem. So, later on, makita na siya. So, while sa qualitative lang siya knowledge, it is actually inherent to managers. So, quantitative knowledge can be learned by studying management science because this will even increase their decision-making skills. So, dara. Kani siya. So, in figure 1.3, kani, okay, we can see that the analysis begins once the problem has been structured. So, according to the book, ingon ang e-book, it usually takes imagination, teamwork, and considerable effort to transform a rather general problem description into a well-defined problem that can be approached via quantitative analysis. So, in structuring the problem, there you go, the analysis of the problem, the qualitative and the quantitative, and then summary nila and evaluation, mo na siya ang imong himuon nga decision. So, this makes sense why mga analysts should be involved in the process of structuring, di ba? because the problem in structuring, because they will be able to understand deeper ang objectives. Kung makaibaw ka, gikan pa lang siya sa pagsugod, sa pag-structure sa problem. It would be easier for you to comprehend sa imuhang action or decision nga ma-provide. So, these are the reasons why a quantitative approach might be used in the decision-making process. So first, if the problem is complex and the manager cannot develop a good solution without the aid of quantitative analysis. If it is too complex nga dili nimo ma-handle qualitatively sa imong decision, so you have to use a quantitative approach. If second, the problem is especially important. So, example dari, if a great deal of money is involved, so one decision might make or break the business. So, dili nimo pwede asat sa imuhang intuition lang. And the manager desires a thorough analysis before attempting to make a decision, of course, diba? Since it involves a great deal of money. Number 3, if the problem is new, wala pa kasugatan ang problem, and the manager has no previous experience from which to draw. And again, dili nimo siya pwede nga, dili siya murag applicable nga ang imong decision is through qualitative lang. Because probably, bugat baron ang problema, unya wa pa kasugatan na. So you have to use the quantitative approach. And if the problem is repetitive and the manager saves time and effort by relying on quantitative procedures to make routine decision recommendations. So, kung makabaw na ka sa quantitative, if you're using quantitative approach, it would be easier for you to delegate a work or a job sa imuhang mga kanang sub-employees if ang problem repetitive na lang siya because it's based on quantitative. So if the manager or the user of the result and the management scientist magkuyog na sila and then they already know the problem since the beginning and the problem has been adequately structured na, they can make a model to represent a problem mathematically and then provide the best solution for the model, then becomes a recommendation to the decision maker. Now, the process of developing and solving models is the essence of quantitative analysis process. Now, let's go to the model development. Maghimo na ta sa iyang model. Now, models are representations of real objects or situations and can be presented in various forms. It's a definition of model. For example, mga example sa mga models, you have iconic models. It is the physical replica. For example, toy airplane or toy truck. A toy truck is a replica of a real truck. Well, toy airplane is also a replica of a real airplane. Diba? Pariha man na siya. Just like your kanang Barbie houses sa una. And then na siya sala, na siya living room, na ay kanang dining, na ana also kanang mga cooking sets, diba? So those were examples of iconic models. We also have analog models. So unlike iconic models, these are physical in form but do not have the same physical appearance as the object being modeled. For example, we have the speedometer of an automobile. So the speedometer of an automobile or the position of its needle represents the speed. Similarly, sa thermometer, the thermometer represents a temperature. So, ang ilang gi-represent, dili siya kanang physically pariha in form. Now, another is the mathematical model. It includes a representation of a problem by a system of symbols and mathematical relationships or expressions. So, kani siya nga type of model, mo ni siya ang atong i-focus diri. So, example, an airplane designer might test an iconic model of a new airplane in a wind tunnel to learn about the potential flying characteristics. So similarly, a mathematical model may be used to make inferences about how much profit will be earned if a specified quantity of a particular product is sold. Now, for example, the total profit nimo can be get after multiplying, for example, in every unit na kay 10 pesos nga profit to the number of products X. So, P is for your profit is equal to 10. Mo na imong profit for each item sold, and then X is the number of units. So, pila imong total profit kung ang imuhang individual profit for each item is 10 and the unit is X. So, that is a mathematical model. Mo siya mathematical representation. Now, the purpose or value of any model is that it enables us to make inferences about the real situation by studying and analyzing the model. For example, katon sa example ganiya, mag-test ka sa airplane. Dili man pwede nga kanang kada test nimo magkuha kag airplane para imong i-test. O niya another na pod kung masayop niya another na pod, di ba? Dili siya pwede. So we need a mathematical model to represent it. Now, here are its importance. So, experimenting with models requires less time and is less expensive than experimenting with the real object or situation. So, matakaingan ganiha. So, again, if, for example, a model airplane is certainly quicker and less expensive to build and study than the full-sized airplane. So, for example, maghimo lang kaparian ng sa mga engineers or sa architect kanang more similar niya nga forma sa building kanang ana siya. And then the value of model-based conclusions and decision is dependent on how well the model represents the situation. So the more closely the model, for example, the airplane, the more closely the model airplane represents the real airplane, the more accurate the conclusion and predictions will be. So, sa katong-atoang example ganiha, the more closely the mathematical model represents the company's kanang profit volume, the more accurate ang imong makuha nga profit projections. So, models also have the advantage of reducing the risk associated with experimenting with the real situation. For example, sa itong example ganiha, dili man pwede nga magpagawas ka og kuan baron 20 ka units just para lang makaibaw ka kung pila ang imuhang profit, because it's very risky kung ang imong gipagawas nga product dili siya mahalin. So, more siya og kanang very stupid siya paminahon, pero imagine if wala ang quantitative, ana jud ang mahitabo niya. So, the more closely the mathematical model represents the company's true profit volume relationship, the more accurate the profit projections will be. So, mo na siya. So, let's go. So, a mathematical expression that describes the problem's objective is called the objective function. So, in the case ganiha, mao to ang P is equal to 10 of 10x. So, mo na siya itong objective function because ang atong objective is to know the total profit if there is 10 pesos profit in each unit sold. So, mo siya, the profit equation P is equal to 10x would be an objective function for a firm attempting to maximize profit. So, a production capacity constraint would be necessary if, for instance, 5 hours are required to produce each unit and only 40 hours of production time are available per week. So, diri na mo sod ang constraint niya, which is the capacity constraint. So, for example, ang atong equation na kay P is equal to 10x mo na sa objective function, but then, ang atong constraint is ang mahimo ora nato in ang hours nga available ra nato in a week is 40 hours. And then, given nga each unit nga mahimo nimo, mohatag na siya og 5 5 hours. So 5 hours for every unit must be less than or equal to 40 hours, which is the total hours available in a week. So, ingana siya. Muna na siya ang constraint nimo, ang number of hours, capacity of hours nga production time. Okay, so muna na siya ang ato equation. 5x is less than or equal to 40 of ano siya. So, the value, muna na siya itong value. 5x is the total time required to produce x units in every unit. And then less than or equal to is the production time required must be less than or equal to 40 hours. And then 40 is the number of hours available in a week. So, muna siya. So, dapat atong saktuhon kung pila di ay kabuok ang atong ma-produce kung each unit kay tag 5 ang iyahang consumption, onya there are only 40 hours in a week. So pila atong mahimo, pila ka products. So the question is how many units of the product should be scheduled each week to maximize profit. So mo na ni siya ang muna ni siya ang atong objective function, katamo ni siya ganina. Ayun ang constraint nato, which is x should be greater or equal to 0, of course, given nga there should be no negative production. And then muna na siya itong objective function. Now, kani siya nga equation is called the linear programming model. So, with the use of this equation, makahimo na taog linear programming model. Now, let's have controllable inputs and the uncontrollable inputs. In instance nga, there are environmental factors that are controlled or determined by the decision maker. So, mo ni siya ang mga inputs nga within the control nimo. Pwede po siya tawagan nga decision variables. Now, example niya is production quantity. Mo na siya ang imuhang ma-control. Environmental factors that are controlled by the decision maker. So, maura na siya ang imuhang ma-control. And then, for uncontrollable inputs, mo na siya mga inputs nga that is beyond your control but can affect the objective functions and the constraint. For example, ang profit, given naman ang profit nga 10. So, di na mo ma-adjust. Dili ka na ang pwede mo ma-adjust. And then, production time per unit, di mo pwede ma-adjust. Kaya tag 5 hours ra dyan ang magamit every product. And then, ang production capacity, 40 raman dyan. 40 hours raman yun ang available every week. So, dili na mo siya mausab. That cannot be controlled. So, ang imo rang ma-control is kung pila ang imuhang, dili ka mag-adjust, pila ang quantity nga imuhang ma-produce. So, figure 1.4, this is the flow chart of the process of transforming model inputs into outputs. So, mo ni siya. Imong uncontrollable inputs, environmental factors, o imong controllable inputs, o decision variables, with those two, makahimo ka og mathematical model, diba? Katong kung ano siya sa controllable kung pila ang quantity, the x. And then kani siya if ang imong controllable kay 5, ang imong 5 hours for every unit, 5 hours imong ma-consume for every unit, and then 40 hours na ka available nga 40 hours, and then your profit should be 10 pesos for every unit. So, di na mo ma-control. So, mo na siya ang controllable inputs together with the controllable inputs, makamihimo ka og mathematical model. And then, from the mathematical model, makahimo na sad ka og output, which is your projected result. So, same ra siya po. So, mo na ni siya, gibutan na siya input. Uncontrollable, again, this is 10 profit per unit, 5 hours production time, and then 40 hours production capacity. And then the value of the production, imong quantity, which is of course from the solution, di ba? Ang answer is 8. So 8 ka products ang imuhang ma-produce given the equation. So, mo na ni siya. Mo na ang imuhang mathematical, mo ni mga linear equation. This is your mathematical model. So, 5 times 8, that should be less than or equal to 40. So, the answer should be 8. And then, from that, makahimo ka og, so ka ito, makahimo ka og output or the projected result, which is your profit, 80, and then ang imong ma-consume nga time is 40 hours. So, that is your output. And then, here are your, from the uncontrollable input, katong tolo, uncontrollable inputs can be deterministic or stochastic or probabilistic model. So, deterministic model, all uncontrollable inputs to a model are known and cannot vary. So, distinguishing feature of a deterministic model is that uncontrollable input values are known in advance. For example, kani siya dili na ni siya mausab. So, steady na dyan na siya. So, example is corporate income tax rate. So, kana naman dyan siya. Mo naman dyan na ang imong income tax rate, di na siya mausab. So, it can be considered deterministic. While stochastic or probabilistic model are uncontrollable inputs that are uncertain and subject to variation. So, distinguishing feature of a stochastic model is that the value of the output cannot be determined even if the value of the controllable input is known. For example, demand for product. Mag-change na siya depending sa season, depende sa kanang economic status, ng ana. So, it can be considered stochastic or probabilistic model na uncontrollable inputs. Okay? So, nakahimo na ta og model, adda na ta sa data preparation. So, data, in this sense, refers to the values of the uncontrollable inputs to the model. So, for example, ang data na ta diri kay kanisya 10 per unit for profit, and then 5 hours per unit for production time, 40 hours for production capacity. Mga na siya to mga data. And then, so, for example, when most sagad sa mga mathematical model situations, kay the data for the uncontrollable inputs are not available. So, when data or uncontrollable input values are not readily available, analysts will usually adapt a general notation for the model development, and then a separate data preparation step will be performed to obtain the uncontrollable input values required by the model. So, siya. Nagimo ta og general notation. And then, katong kuwang, himuan na po siya og separate data preparation step. So, mo ni siya ang general notation. For example, we can use the variable C for the profit per unit, A to represent the production time in hours per unit, and B to represent the production capacity in hours. So, the model development step of the production problem would result in the following general model. So, mag-use lang jud kaani nga kanang variables. So, A of X is less than or equal to B, and X should be greater than or equal to 0. Pamaura man na siya sa ato ang linear equation. But sa general notation ni siya. So, in cases nga dili available ang uncontrollable inputs niya, kay maghimo ka og separate data preparation para makahimo ka sa uncontrollable inputs before going to maghimo ka og general notation. So, data preparation. So, let's go to model solution. After nimo og kuha sa data, mag-prepare na ka sa maghimo na ka sa model. So, model solution is identifying the values of the decision variables that provide the best output for the model. Now, the specific decision variable gani nimo nga imong mapili, which is to consider the best output, muna na siya ang tawag nimo og optimal solution. Now, sa problem na to, the model solution step involves finding the value of the production quantity decision variable X that maximizes profit while not causing a violation of the production capacity constraint. So, ano siya? Maghimo na taog solution niya. So, sa paghimong solution, pwede na to i-apply ang trial and error approach. So, it is a model used to test and evaluate various decision alternatives. So, for example, ang imong solution, i-apply na kasi imong solution, and then the constraints are satisfied, tanan nga constraint, that solution will be considered feasible. But if a particular decision or alternative does not satisfy one or more of the model constraint, then that is considered infeasible. So you have to take note nga tanan nga imong constraint, tanan jud, all constraint should be satisfied. Now, through this trial and error process of evaluating selected decision alternatives, a decision maker can identify a good and possibly the best feasible solution to the problem through trial and error approach. Now, model development and model solution steps are not completely separable. That should not be separable because sa model development, diri ka magsugod og himo. And then, sa model solution, himuan na nimo og solution ang imuhang problem. So, dapat di na siya mag-separate. So, for example, mo ni siya imong trial and error solution. So, imong decision alternative, if akong product ka ma-produce kay 0, of course, 0, 0, 0. And then, if, for example, duha akong ma-produce. So, ang imong projected profit, since tag 10 man siya, so 20. And then, total hours of production, since tag 5 man each, so 10. And then, is it a feasible solution? Yes, it's a feasible solution. But, ang atong pangitaon is the best nga imuhang solution. So, if ever, mabot ka diri, 12 imuhang ma-produce. So, projected profit, 120. Hindot kayo. Onya, ang total hours of production, 60 man. Diba, 40 raman to dapat. So, is it a feasible solution? No. So, kung diin ma-maximize ang imuhang profit, anya, masatisfy to nimo ang constraint, ang imong profit is 80, mo na siya ang maximum. And then, ang total hours of production, 40. Satisfied imong kana nga constraint. So, is it a feasible solution? Yes. So, ang imuha din production quantity should be 8. Mo na siya ang pinaka-feasible. Model, dari na. After ato, mag-test na ka. Model testing and validation are frequently conducted with relatively small test problems that have known or at least expected solution. So, for example, the result of the application, man siyang result of the application of alternatives. So, model and output information, na nakay-model and output information. So, if it is correct, then you go ahead. Maybe, the go-ahead may be given to use the model on the full-scale problem. I-apply na siya. But, if the model and input information are incorrect, of course, there should be a corrective action na i-perform, such as model modification, osbonimo, and or collection of more accurate input data may be taken. So, hana. So, dirita. After nimo og model solution, mag-report na ka sa report generation. So, report generation is the preparation of managerial report based on the model's solution. So, kani, di ba? Mamani siya ang ato ang base sa figure 1.3. This is the role of qualitative and quantitative. So, base ato, nakaimata sa report generation. So, that the result of the model must appear in a managerial report and can be easily understood by the decision maker. Take note of that. So, results sa imong model, kailangan ma-appeal na siya if sakto ha, if correct siya. So, dapat ma-appear na siya sa managerial report and Such report must be easily understood by the decision maker. So who are the decision makers? Probably, aside sa manager, there could be like for stockholders, investors, mga yan. And then the report includes the recommended decision and other pertinent information about the results that may be helpful to the decision maker. So dili ra kamo stop nga ipakita nimo ang solusyon nga kanisakto siya sa managerial report. Dili ra pod kamo stop after nga ma-sure nimo nga understandable na siya. Dapat maghimo di ka didto og mga recommended, mga possible decisions, mga recommend nga decision nga helpful siya sa decision maker. Ayan. So lastly, a note regarding implementation. After na imo na siyang i-implement. That the manager should continue to monitor the contribution of the model during the implementation and follow-up. So upon implementation, the manager should follow up because ara na nimo ma-distinguish kung successful ba siya or di. And then, if the result of the quantitative analysis process are not correctly implemented, the entire effort, of course, may be of no value. So, manday last na, dira na ka sa last na part, dira na noon ka dira na noon imo buhian, di ba? So, useless ang imong effort sa previous nga mga steps. Now, one of the most effective ways to ensure successful implementation is to include users throughout the modeling process. So, dara dyan na siya. Because, ang imong goal is not just for yourself sa imuhang satisfaction. Because, kana siya nga imuhang kanang plan, kanang model nga imong gihimo para man na siya sa users. So, mas maayo kung imong apilon ang users para makita nimo ang satisfactory rate nila. Okay? So, that will be all for the topic outline. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I am Angelyn Acabal and I am going to discuss another topic. So please stay tuned and don't worry because this will not take long. So Ms. Fritzie already discussed about problem solving and decision making, quantitative analysis and decision making, quantitative analysis, model development. So this is just in connection about model development that was discussed by Fritzie. This topic is about how management science may be used to help managers make better decisions. The focus of this text is on the decision-making process and on the role of management science in that process. We will also discuss the problem orientation of this process and in an overview show how mathematical models can be used in this type of analysis. So yes, we all know that mathematical models are just abstractions of the real-world situation. And it cannot view all the aspects of the real situation, right? However, if a mathematical model can capture the major relevant aspects of the problem and can provide solution recommendation, of course, it can be valuable aid to decision making. Management science that will become increasingly apparent as we proceed through the text is the search for a best solution to the problem. In carrying out the quantitative analysis, we shall be attempting to develop procedures for finding the best or optimal solution. So as I said a while ago, we have these three models: the cost and volume models, revenue and volume models, profit and volume models, and lastly, we will show the result of the three models by using the break-even analysis. Before that, you might be asking, why is it very important to use mathematical models in our decision making? Well, it is very important because it can benefit the financial planning, production planning, sales quotas, and decision making. It can benefit financial planning in a way that it helps executives explore the result of their various business strategies. Yes, these models can be simple or complex, but their essential function is to provide answers to what-if financial questions posed by executive. On the other hand, It will help the production planning and the development of strategic tactical model for the distribution of production. And for the sales quotas, they set expectations and motivate sales representatives to hit a given level of activity. Managers can also use self quotas to learn more about their team's productivity, success rate, and optimal sales processes. Lastly, decision making, which is the most important benefit that the models could give. So it enables the decision maker to make best decisions that could greatly impact the firm. Now, let us use Nolan Plastics as example so that we can create the three models. Let me read the scenario for you. Nolan Plastics produces a variety of compact disc storage cases. Nolan's best-selling product is the CD50, a slim, plastic CD holder with a specially designed lining that protects the optical surface of the disc. Several products are produced in the same manufacturing line, and the setup cost is incurred each time a changeover is made for a new product. Suppose that the setup cost for the CD50 is $3,000. This setup cost is a fixed cost that is incurred regardless of the number of units eventually produced. In addition, suppose that the variable labor and material costs are $2 for each unit produced. From the example I read, we are given $3,000 and $2 as a cost. So let us begin by creating the cost model. Cost and volume models. The cost of manufacturing or producing a product is a function of the volume produced. The most basic inputs to a cost model are the cost elements captured by accountants. For example, is direct labor, materials, and overhead. However, documenting the cost element is only a start. A cost model should capture the drivers of cost such as labor productivity or hourly wage rates. We can also categorize these kinds of cost elements into two types, the fixed cost and variable cost. When you say fixed cost, it is the portion of the total cost that does not depend on the production volume. This cost remains the same no matter how much is produced. Fixed costs include the cost of being in business. They might include the rent being paid per month, contractual agreements, utilities, license fees, rent for a store or plant, and the cost of furnishings and equipment. On the other hand, the variable cost is the portion of the total cost that is dependent on and varies with the production volume. And the variable costs are tied to the amount you produce or sell. They might include raw material for a manufacturer or the cost of goods sold for someone in sales. From the Nolan Plastics example, we are given two costs, the $3,000 and the $2. So we will just identify the marginal cost. By the way, the marginal cost is the cost added by producing one additional unit of a product or service. It is stated in here that the setup cost $3,000 is the fixed cost that is incurred regardless of the number of units eventually produced. So, we can directly infer that our marginal cost is the $2 because it is what we are going to add in every unit produced to create the cost and volume model. So, C or the cost equal to 3,000 plus the $2 which is the marginal cost times X, where X is our production volume in units. However, it does not stop there because the management of Nolan Plastic also want information on the projected revenue associated with selling a specified number of units. So that will lead us to create the revenue and volume model. So suppose that each CD50 storage unit sells for $5, so we can directly create the model for our revenue. Since our marginal revenue is fixed, so we can just directly write our equation as revenue equals $5 times X, where X is the sales volume in units. So we have now the equation 1 and the equation 2 or we already created the cost and volume models and the revenue volume model. Lastly, we can now create our profit and volume model. So we can just combine equation 1 and 2 to develop a profit volume model that will determine the total profit associated with a specified production sales volume. So just like creating our income statement, the same goes for the process in this type of model. So we can just directly use our revenue minus cost so we can get our profit. So the total profit, denoted as P, is equal to total revenue minus total cost. So therefore, the following model provides the total profit associated with producing and selling units. So by just combining the two, we can now have the equation 3, which is the profit equals negative 3,000 plus 3 times x. Let's try to use our profit and volume model. So for example, the demand forecast indicates that 500 units of the product can be sold. So using the equation 3, negative 3,000 plus 3 times 500, 3 times 500 is 1,500. So negative 3,000 plus positive 1,500 equals negative 1,500. So the manager can know that if they will just going to produce 500 units, then they will not gain or they will result to loss. This is why we need to use the break-even analysis to get the break-even point. Break-even analysis is a technique widely used by production management and management accountants. It is based on categorizing production costs between those which are variable and those that are fixed. Ang break-even analysis, guys, iyang ipakita ang variable and fixed cost and sales revenue para ma-identify kung ang business nag-make pa og profit or loss. So the volume that results in total revenue equaling total cost is what we call break-even point. The break-even point for a product provides valuable information for a manager who must make a yes or no decision concerning production of the product. Again, by just using the equation 3, we can get that the 1,000 unit is the break-even point. Therefore, the manager can quickly infer that a volume above the break-even point will result in a profit, whereas a volume below the break-even point will result in a loss. So just look at the break-even chart in the right side. So in its simplest form, the break-even chart is a graphical representation of costs at various levels of activity shown on the same chart as the variation of income with the same variation in activity. So tanawa ang orange line. It represents the variation of income at varying levels of production activity. And then the yellow line represents the total fixed costs in the business. Sa ako pang giingon kaniha, kaning break-even analysis is a very useful tool jud siya for determining at what point your company or new product or service will be profitable. Let's take a look at the graph of the break-even analysis for Nolan Plastics. So we can see in the graph that if the manager decides to produce only 500 units, it will result to $1,500 of loss. Then, we have 1,000 units as the break-even point wherein no loss, no profit. And then, we can see in 1,800 units, we can gain a $2,400 profit because the revenue is 9,000 minus the 6,600 cost, then it will result to 2,400 profit. That ends our discussion about models. But we're not done yet. Where do you think the creating models to help in decision making take us? It takes us to management science technique, or generally refers to mathematical or quantitative methods for business decision making. According to reference for business.com, Management science techniques was initially developed by Frederick Winslow Taylor in the early 90s and were further developed during World War II. Because World War II posed many military, strategic, logistic, and tactical problems. So, the operation research teams of engineers, mathematicians, and statisticians were motivated to use the scientific method to find solutions to many of these problems. There are really many management science techniques, but the most frequently used are the linear programming, integer programming, simulation, and distribution network modeling. I will just give you the background of the techniques, and don't worry because it will be reported in the next chapters. First is the linear programming. Linear programming is a problem-solving approach developed for situations involving maximizing, minimizing linear functions subject to linear constraints that limit the degree to which the objective can be pursued. Linear programming is also called linear optimization. It is a method to achieve the best outcome in a mathematical model, such as pwede niyang mapakita ang maximum profit in a lowest cost. It can be applied to a variety of business problems such as marketing mix determination, financial decision making, production scheduling, workforce assignment, and resource blending. So, ang mga industries nga nagamit ang linear programming model includes transportation, energy, telecommunications, and manufacturing. Second is integer linear programming. It is an approach used for problems that can be set up as linear programs with the additional requirement that some or all of the decision variables be integer values. This is particularly useful when modeling production processes for which fractional amounts of products can be produced. Now let's go to simulation. Simulation is a technique used to model the operation of a system. This technique employs a computer program to model the operation and perform simulation computation. Simulation modeling solves real-world problems safely and efficiently. Makatag ni siya important method of analysis which is sayo na siya verified, i-communicate, and easy to understood resad. Across industries and disciplines, simulation modeling provides valuable solutions by giving clear insights into complex systems. So, this is normally used to access the current or predict the future performance of a business process. So, this program is usually helpful because it employs technologies. The distribution network modeling is still a process happen because it involves current or potential network infrastructure to determine trade-off between service level performance and total cost associated with providing a given service level. This model enables us to quickly solve problems in such areas as transportation, system design, information system design, and project scheduling. Now let's move on to techniques that are not frequently used yet still useful. First is the inventory models. It is used by managers faced with the dual problems of maintaining sufficient inventories to meet demand for goods and at the same time incurring the lowest possible inventory holding costs. So for example, those factories are big factories that hold different kinds of products. So they will use this model so that they can know how to manage their inventories properly. Next is the analytical hierarchy. It is a multi-criteria decision-making technique permits the inclusion of subjective factors in arriving at a recommended decision. This is good for decision-making in complex environment in which kanaganing daghang mga variables or criteria nga gi-consider ang usa ka manager or decision maker. We also have this nonlinear programming, which is a technique that allows for maximizing or minimizing a nonlinear function subject to nonlinear constraint. So this is an opposite of the linear programming that we had a while ago. And this one is also helpful when the objective function, or at least one of the constraints, is not linear, and with respect to values of at least one decision variable. Another technique is the problem scheduling, PERT or CPM. The PERT, or the Program Evaluation and Review Technique, and CPM, or Critical Path Method techniques, help managers carry out their project scheduling responsibilities. So, kanisa siya is gamit ni siya, for example, sa planning costs, scheduling manpower, and machine time. This is really helpful in answering important questions of a project. We also have this forecasting method, or a technique that can be used to predict the future aspects of a business operation. So we are all familiar with this one because this is about looking forward of the future. Then the waiting line or queuing models that have been developed to help managers understand and make better decisions concerning the operation and systems involving waiting lines. So from the name itself, this model can really help in creating an efficient and cost-effective workflow. For example, in the firm, they are faced with many types of decision making. That's why they need to organize the important things and separate those concerns that are not urgent. Another technique or model that is also very effective is the Markov process model. It is useful in studying the evolution of certain systems over repeated trials. For example, Markov processes have been used to describe the probability that a machine functioning in one period will function or break down in another period. This is important for us to know the life of the machine we have in our business. Next to Markov process model is the goal programming. So this is a technique for solving multi-criteria decision problems, usually within the framework of linear programming. So this can also help in minimization of a deviation in higher priority level, being infinitely more important than all deviations in lower priority level. So it helps a firm identify lower priority levels. And then, last but not the least, is the decision analysis technique. So it can be used to determine optimal strategies in situations involving several decisions alternatives and an uncertain or risk-filled pattern of event. This technique is about evaluating decisions, most especially katong na mga risky nga decisions na i-face ang mga firm. So they need this type of technique for them to really say that the decision they take is the right one or the best one. And that ends my presentation. I hope you learned something about the introduction of management science. Again, this is Angelyn Acabal speaking. It's been a pleasure torturing you with all the wordy speeches. Thank you. Have a great day.